is part of the programming around Journal Digital Archives. And the Geojit Foundation supports the Journal Archives and builds on the museum's founder, Madhav Nayar's dream of making history accessible to all. For those of you who have seen the History Museum in the round building up front there, and I've had this question asked many times, what are you going to do to change the format of the History Museum there? The thing is, people really love it. So then we said, how do we address this? That on the one side, people love the History Museum just the way it is, but we still want to start looking at history in a different way. We want to start doing history in different ways. And so was born this Journal Digital Archive idea. We were lucky enough to have the guidance of CJ George of the Geojit Foundation, who insisted that we do have this live discussion platform as well, where we can have both academics and subject experts, as well as an enthusiast on history who's an expert on the subject, come and present and open the floor to Q&A. So today in the 42nd talk, we are hosting the launch of the book IRU, The Remarkable Life of Irawati Karve, in association with Speaking Tiger Books. The book IRU is a novel-shaped biography that tells the story of India's first woman sociologist and anthropologist. I'm going to introduce the speakers next. Urmilla Deshpande, who was going to speak today but is unwell, is one of the authors of the book. She writes novels and short fiction. Her published work includes A Pack of Lies, Slither, Carnal Prose, and Body and Blood, Stories on Breaking the 10 Commandments. We will miss Urmilla here today. We hope she's watching us on YouTube live right now. Thiago Pinto Barbosa is a Brazilian anthropologist based in Leipzig and Berlin. An assistant professor at Leipzig University, Thiago's multi-award-winning doctoral dissertation was published as Racializing Caste, Anthropology Between Germany and India, and the Legacy of Irawati Karve, 1905 to 1970. Anuja is the founder of Drama Queen, Anuja Ghosalkar, who we know here at the museum now, been here several times. A documentary theatre company in India since 2015. Her multidisciplinary work explores little histories, archival gaps, and audience performer hierarchies. Focused on feminism, transnational collaborations, and counter-narratives, she teaches at art institutions and has written for Bloomsbury, Routledge, and Bioscope. She is co-editing a book on documentary performance in India, Transcript 2025. Anuja has led workshops at Oxford, JNU, Serendipity Arts Festival, and Kerala Museum. Her current touring show, I Promise the Bearer, playfully examines the complex relationship between artists, funders, and the art market. If you ever get a chance, please experience the show somewhere. Tissa Khosla, originally from Mumbai, India, Tissa began his musical and professional life in Tallahassee, Florida, as a student. Gravitating to the baritone saxophone from a young age, he remains in pursuit of its deep and moving sound, which he believes coincides with his own voice and philosophy of music. Khosla can be heard alongside the modern jazz generation on a recording entitled United We Play, featuring the American Symphony Orchestra. Welcome, the three of you. Before we go into the lecture, I want to remind you all of a few house rules. The talk will be for approximately, the reading will be for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A with Anu, and then the floor will be open for questions. So please take notes, everyone. And please put your mobile phones on silent during the talk and reading. And if you urgently have a call, please step outside the hall and take it. Thank you. Now, over to you, Thiago. Welcome you to Journal Talks.
Okay, now it's on. Thank you so much, everybody, for organizing and for inviting us to present this here today. We're really happy to be here. I'm very happy to be here again in Kochi. This is one of my favorite places in India. So it feels really nice to present this book here. I'm going to be reading there. So this is a book that I wrote together with Urmilla Deshpande. Should I go here now, just for this? Okay. I'm not saying much now, but so this is a book that Urmilla Deshpande and I wrote together over the course of a few years. It is also a product of my very long PhD research that was also about Irawati Karve. But before I tell more about her and before I start with the readings, we would like to make a musical overture. So I'm going to hand it over to Tisa.
Good evening, everyone. So I just wanted to say, first of all, I'm very excited to be here and honored to be a part of this. Many of you might be wondering what I'm doing up here with a saxophone. Well, there are two reasons. The first, of course, is that Irawati Karve was my great-grandmother. Her openness towards life's possibilities and to the freedom of an individual was passed on to my grandmother, Gauri Deshpande, and to my mother, Urmilla, and then to me. So that's why I'm here now, an Indian-born saxophonist playing Black American music known as jazz. The second reason has to do with this music, jazz music. It's music that is synonymous with improvisation, self-definition, flexibility, sophistication, virtuosity, and a music that makes an individual responsible to the community, but also makes that community responsible to the individual. A music for home, a music that is a home for anyone who wants to call it that. So in a way, the IRU statement is the jazz statement. And so that's why I'm going to play for you. So the first piece I'm going to play is inspired by the first passage that we're going to hear. And it's a song that was released in Berlin in 1928, I believe. And it's entitled Mac the Knife.
So, Berlin, 1928. The train and a walk under old chestnut trees took her to Innerstrasse 22. She hurried to exchange the warmth inside her coat for a lab coat, thin from overwashing and bleach. She stepped out into the corridor, high ceiling, no windows. It was a long concrete cavern between the archive room and the lab. The sound of her steps multiplied itself off the walls and the ceiling. If she closed her eyes, there was a legion of Iravatis in bleached white coats walking with her, each holding a tray with human skulls covered in bleached white cloth. The tray was heavy, grain-painted iron. Her wrists trembled, and it was always a relief to put it down on the table. She lifted the cloth off, folded it, and placed it to the side. She sat down. Then, as she always did, she examined the skulls one by one. All these skulls were from German East Africa, Rwanda, Tanzania, and also from Melanesia. She knew what people from these places looked like. She looked into their eye sockets, tried to feel in the eyes, the eyelashes, the skin, the hair, and then the smile, the person. Sometimes she conjured up a man, sometimes a woman, sometimes a girl, and once, when it was a very small skull, she imagined a baby who had never walked on its own feet. The skulls weren't all the same, of course. They were all different, the colors, the shapes, the grooves, the deeps. But she knew that neither she nor anyone else could just tell by looking at one whether it had belonged to a dead German soldier or a murdered Namibian woman. She didn't think about that too much, or she wouldn't be able to do this work. But it was always there with her, this sense of violation, an irrational sense that these skulls and bones belong or longed to be home. "Forgive me," she said softly, as she always did to each one of those skulls. The crates of human remains that arrived at the Institute went to the basement of the building at Innerstrasse 22 in Berlin, Dahlem, before being archived in the attic of the building. A large room, bright with windows and overhead globe lamps, was the first stop for the bones. Here they were unpacked and placed in rows on shelves, specially made to hold rows of skulls. Students such as Irawati had access to them. In order to produce skull measurements, Irawati used an instrument called a craniophore. This is essentially a glass box. The skull is set inside in at a right angle. A transparent paper is placed on the top on the glass. The skull seen through the paper is then drawn onto the paper. Then a new sheet of paper is placed, and the angle of the skull is changed, drawn again, and so on. Then the differences between all the points on all those pieces of paper are calculated. The work took effort, concentration, and time. It's only one of the myriad human inventions that seem somehow important and scientific, that seem to be generating data that is important and scientific, that will confirm or unravel important theories by scientific method. If the method sounds arcane and reminiscent of palm reading or phrenology, things that no serious person would take seriously today, it is because these do all belong in the same rubbish bin of ideas that humanity is better off discrediting and discarding. But they're still with us, still doing exactly what they were doing then, finding differences between humans, but more dangerously, assigning meaning and hierarchies to those differences based on the politics of the assigner, meaning in this case, a professor, Eugen Fischer. As she held these remains in her hands, what questions would Irawati, a woman, a Hindu, a Brahmin, a colonial subject, ask of what lay before her, about Germany and its colonial project, about Indians, about gender, about religion, about race, about the dead, about herself? And having asked, how then would she answer them? So this is a passage from the beginning of our book. I'm just going to comment a little bit on this passage. So I studied in the same building that Irawati studied, of course, many years later. She went to Berlin in 1927 to undertake her PhD in anthropology. And she ended up doing her PhD research in a building that used to host a center for research on eugenics, human genetics, and anthropology. This place became more famous after 1933, after the Nazis took power, as this center became very closely entangled with Nazi politics and had a huge influence on how Nazi population policies were developed. And I did an exhibition about this place with a historical research about this place when I was a student in that same building that is now just part of the University of Berlin. So that Center for Research in Eugenics was closed after the end of the war, the Second War. And I researched everybody who were researching that place. I read all the papers of students and researchers who researched at that place. And I was very surprised to see that there were quite a few international students, but the only paper produced in that institute that contradicted a racist theory of that time and place was Irawati Karve's PhD research. So her professor had asked her to test a hypothesis that the skull of white Europeans would have a more developed right side, because it was believed in that time and place, Germany, 1927, that white Europeans would be, because they were more civilized, they would have a bigger rational side of the brain, the right side. So that professor, Eugen Fischer, asked Irawati to test his hypothesis, and she would do so by measuring different skulls that were brought to Germany from many different colonized territories, but also skulls of white Europeans, and to test his hypothesis. And she measured over 140, she measured 149 skulls, and she found out that she could not observe such a correlation between that kind of skull asymmetry, that the right side of the skull would be bigger, and race. And that's quite remarkable to think that the only paper in that place that contradicted a racist theory was written by an Indian woman. For those who don't know Irawati, she's quite known in Maharashtra, of course, where she was from. She's from Pune. She went to the university in Pune, Ferguson College, and then later in Bombay, did her PhD in Germany, and then she went back to Pune, where she worked until the last day of her life in 1970. She might be known for her work on the Mahabharata, especially through her book Yugant, which is an interpretation of that epic. And a special interpretation because it also applies a feminist lens to understand the characters in the Mahabharata. She's also known in anthropology for her work on caste. She wrote some famous books like Kinship, Organization of India, and Hindu Society and Interpretation. And she was a very public scholar. She participated in many events, in radio shows, and she was commenting many different political events in the very turbulent time that she was alive, 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So she wrote a lot also about culture, Indian culture, about women in Indian society, and also about religion. And this brings me to another passage that I'm going to read. But just to explain, so religiosity was a very important topic in Karve's life and work. She was very much inspired by the teachings of ancient Sanskrit texts. And even though she lived surrounded by atheists in her family, so the Karves were known as famous atheists in Maharashtra, she did not have just an anthropological fascination about religion. She also sometimes, she was interested in the cultural aspects of religion, but she also lived that experience of religion at the same time that she studied it. And she also changed her opinion about religious questions in India quite a lot. And that's also something that's important to think with. So in 1947, right before the agony of partition, she wrote a speech that was a sharp criticism of Islam. But later she changed her mind. In the 1950s and 60s, having thought a lot about what had happened in Germany as well, and about how monoethnic nationalism has led to so much suffering and genocide of so many millions of people, she embraced the values of multiculturalism, the values of multi-religiosity, the values of multi-language in her view of India. At the same time that she was critical of the aspects of religion that lead to fanaticism and political bigotry, including Hinduism. So before I start with the passage, I'm going to ask Tisa again to play a song. Don't worry, it's not his last song.
This is a piece by John Coltrane called Lonnie's Lament.
The Bhima River becomes a crescent as it curves at the town of Pandharpur. So there the river has the sweet name of Chandrabhaga. In Pandharpur lives Vithoba. He has stood on a brick in the temple since before memory. Vithoba was there before Irawati found her way to him, and there he still stands and always will, though Irawati will never visit him again. Irawati did not come from a family who belonged to the cult of Vithoba, and nor, of course, did the atheist Karves. So she had never been to Pandharpur. It's a mystery as to why she became enamored of Vithoba, why he should sit so deeply in her heart and mind, so much that she was willing to join the annual pilgrimage and walk all the way from Pune to Pandharpur. Her Marathi essay, On the Road, is full of detail about the walk. The heat and the clouds, the villages and towns they passed through on their days-long march, the meals they ate, the bullocks and dogs, and her fellow pilgrims, all are written about, lovingly, it can be said. And then there is Vithoba himself. Irawati was fascinated by the relationship individual pilgrims have with their God. A theme comes up again and again as she talks to men and women. A woman in the depths of sorrow tells Irawati that her only son, a young man in his 20s, had died. Another woman talks of her great sorrow that she never had any children and how empty her life and her house are. A man who has lost his wife and children in an epidemic says to Irawati, "You know, Vithoba is a very hard god. If your heart gets entangled in something, he tears it out." All these people acknowledge that the same Vithoba to whom they are now walking, having left their towns and villages and families and lives to go see, is the one who creates their sorrows, but also the one to whom they turn for solace when he does. Irawati asks Vithoba, "Why do you let the heart get entangled in the first place? And why then do you tear it out? What greatness do you get from this?" And then, surprised at herself, thinks again. She writes, Oh, but I was out of my mind. The agony of the old woman made me forget the world for a moment. Who brings whom to his feet? It's all a play of the human mind. First, it creates a God with qualities out of a completely indifferent, formless, and attributeless principle. Then makes him the author of everything that happens, makes him the Lord of the universe, and then says, we can only have what he does not take. Here, she demonstrates that since gods create the concepts of sorrow or joy that affect human life, they are before and therefore immune to such things. But also, in an Ouroboros logic, that the human mind creates these gods. Irawati, at the end of the journey, feels anguish as they approach Pandharpur. These people who have been her companions on the road, with whom she has shared the sorrows and joys of her life, and who in turn have opened their hearts to her, will soon be parted from her. She knows, as they do, that they will never, in this life, see each other again. As they approach the final steps of the plateau, her own eyes and those of every person around her are streaming. In her sadness, she looks around for the one who has walked with them. She sees him, his back to her, walking away in the other direction. Her words at the end of the essay speak to every heart, be they atheist or devotee of Vitoba. She writes, "Why, Dark One, are you leaving too? Are you not coming to Pandharpur?" He smiled and shook his head. "Where are you off to?" Without a word, he merely waved his arm and began to walk fast. The black ploughed fields and the sky full of heavy black clouds soon engulfed the delicate dark figure with the blanket on his shoulder. And I stepped inside the gates of Pandharpur with streaming eyes, weary legs, and a heavy heart. Irawati's Marathi essays reveal sides of her that are not always visible in her English and academic work. These are personal works, and she wrote them so that she could speak about her ways of thinking and looking at the world and feeling, especially those ways that are not academic. Taken together with her academic work, they reveal the multitudes that she contained. She's that anthropologist, that intellectual and distant observer, aware that we make those Khandobas and Vitobas, perhaps not in our image, but to give us solace and succor, so we can lay the blames of our existence at their feet. And standing on the final stretch of ground that would take her to Pandharpur, the place of parting the pilgrims called the Weeping Plateau, she shows us, whether she knows it or not, that she herself belongs to the cult of Vitoba. In today's India, where the eye will find no temple-free horizon, where larger and larger Ganesh and Sai Baba statues are remaking the land into a Hinduscape, where the Pandharpur pilgrimage is now a commercially sponsored event that draws people in the hundreds of thousands, Irawati might have been at least a little uncomfortable. Perhaps she would be saddened, angered even, by the obsession with a single animal and the making of the cow, as well as various historical figures into mascots for a manufactured religion that bears no likeness to the ancient teachings that she was so familiar with. Maybe she had foreseen all of this. Maybe she forewarned us in her way of what was to come when she wrote about the Dark One turning away from the gates of Pandharpur. Hers is a powerful, poignant, and even pessimistic message after all, of a God abandoning those most in need of him, the God Vitoba walking away from the pilgrims who had gathered there for a glimpse of him, without a word, she says, without a backward glance into the gathering storm. So this is it for now, and we're gonna have...
This is entitled, "I'm Going to Lay Down My Burdens Down by the Riverside."
invite Anu now to join the stage so we can have a conversation.
Tessa, thank you for that. That was just beautiful. And all the questions I have after that music seem so mundane and dry and boring. So maybe I should not ask these questions. No, Thiago, thank you so much for this book. It's really special. And this evening is special for many reasons because as Irawati writes about kinship, for me, being at the Kerala Museum that is run by Aditi, being next to Thiago, both of them have been friends of mine for a long time. We speak across countries, we speak across genders and different art forms and practices. So I feel really sort of blessed to be here today and to be in conversation. So having said that, maybe I should open my notes. Okay, for those of you who haven't read the book, the opening lines of this book are almost as iconic as Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. Salman Rushdie opens it by saying, I was born in the city of Bombay once upon a time, but the year and the date is important, on the 15th of August, 1947. Iconic lines for people who studied literature. Great Expectations opens with Charles Dickens saying, my father's name being Pirip and my Christian name being Philip, I call myself Pip. But IRU opens with these lines. Human skulls are not smooth. Thiago, really powerful 5 phrases as soon as I opened the book. How did you come to this kind of a phrase? You and Umi both, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I have to say now, this is not a conventional biography. I think we didn't want to start a book that starts with the day this person was born. She was born in Burma at the Irawati River, therefore the name Irawati. We wanted to have a narrative that really makes us think about important questions in science, in politics, important philosophical questions. And because Irawati's research in Berlin was so connected to questions of research on what was called race, right? And research using human skulls, we thought it would be good to start the narrative with that moment in Berlin. Also because Berlin in the 1920s was a very special place. There was a lot of very progressive thinking in science, in the arts, right? Many interesting things being done in film as well. Berlin was a very queer place in the 1920s. They had a very famous sexology institute researching about trans issues and questions of sexuality in general, very progressive. At the same time that there was this something in the air about rising fascists, right? And a counter, a backlash. And there were many international students in Berlin at that time in place. Also because Germany was sponsoring international students from South Asia to come to Berlin to study, so they could have a spot in Europe to conspire against empire. So there were many anti-colonial South Asian students in Berlin who made that choice to go to Germany instead of going to the UK, where they would have been observed. And they came to Germany to then study, but also engage in political activity. And Irawati also made that anti-colonial choice, let's say, and her work there was using skulls, right? She was researching on skulls, and she was asked to test this very racist hypothesis, but then she concluded that there is no such thing as that kind of skull shape and what was called race. And I think that's the beginning of the book, because we're going to think about different questions of science and politics and human difference and variation, anthropology, throughout the whole book.
Yeah, thank you. And it's also a line that kept me very engaged. And I said, okay, this is going to be something I want to stay with. This also brings me to the question of what you said earlier, that this biography doesn't read like a conventional biography at all. Like, it doesn't start with the day she was born. And also, it reads like fiction to me. It's a page turner, like one of the reviews in the newspaper said. It moves quite fast. And I think what's interesting is the collaboration between Thiago, who's an anthropologist, and Urmilla, who's not here today, is a fiction writer. So I'm really curious if both of you were here, but you're here today, to ask you, how did you all write together? Because it's hard enough writing alone, but two people singing in one voice, or was it more like an improvised jam session, like jazz? You were trying things out. But really take us through this process of two very different practices writing as one, because unlike the skull, it's very smooth. Bad joke, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a question we keep getting. And the first time we got this question, we were like, we just did it. But now that I'm thinking back, there was a lot of thought in the process. So Urmilla is a fiction writer. That's her first work of nonfiction. And I am a very boring academic. So the stuff that I write is meant for an academic audience of maybe 5 people who know about the topic that I research on. And because I was writing my PhD about questions of the idea of race in anthropology and about this connection of Germany and India in anthropology, but I was so fascinated by Irawati as a person and as a historical figure, and I had a lot about her in my PhD thesis, but my supervisor was very unhappy. She was like, you shouldn't put all this biographic information in anthropology PhD thesis. So I had a lot of stories that I collected over the course of 6 years. So I lived in Pune for quite some time, maybe a whole year, and I was digging in archives, both in Germany and India, talking to a lot of people who knew Karve, her son, her daughter, who were still alive, some of her students were still alive, and colleagues, to collect several stories and memories of her. And then I had a lot of material that I couldn't fit into a PhD thesis. And at some point, Urmilla was asked to write a biography about her grandmother. And she said, well, I'm not a biography writer. I couldn't do this. So if she has to do it, she'll do it with me. And I said, okay, let's do it. And by that time, we already knew each other. At first, Urmilla wanted to write a fiction inspired by the grandmother. So it would have been a fiction about an Indian woman in Berlin in the 1920s. But then she dropped that idea, at least for now, and we worked on the biography together. And in this process, we met several times in Berlin. We walked the places, went to the places where Irawati lived, worked, went to school. We tried to get a feeling of the city. So we read a lot of books about Berlin in the 1920s. We researched in different archives, and we constructed this narrative flow together. And we were writing bits by bits, each person at one time, sometimes together in a shared document online. And we were talking along the way. And this took over a year, but it was a very pleasant process also because we got to be very close friends and to agree on the very basic things about the book. And the first thing that was very important for me to agree on was that we don't want to write a hero story. So this is not about praising Irawati for being the best and the greatest. She was the first woman anthropologist in India. There are many great things about her, but she also has flaws, and there are things in her writings that are worth discussing. And she agreed on that. Even though she's a family member, she was very conscious of that, and that's something that we both managed to develop together, both critique and empathy.
That's fascinating that you say both critique and empathy. And Irawati, if you read the book, you'll see is a very checkered, complicated character. And we were saying earlier, quite gray. And I was saying she's a very atypical heroine. And Thiago said, we don't want to tell the hero story. So I find that also really fascinating. We spoke briefly, or you briefly mentioned this thing about the archive, and because also, as Aditi said, this journal talk is also about digital online archives. In the book, you all say that there were many gaps in the archive, and that especially women in science, there's very little. So Thiago, what is it that you all did when historical material was missing? You all say you turned to something called critical fabulation. And Umi says that what she writes is not fiction where there were gaps. So how did you approach missing research material? What did you do?
Right, so I think this is a common problem that many of us working with history have when we're trying to write history about science, but specifically about the global south in general, where archives are don't contain as much as, let's say, archives in Europe or in the US. And critical fabulation is a term that helped us through this process, and it was coined by an African-American scholar, Hartman is her name, who wanted to write about African women who were enslaved and brought to the US to work as slaves, right? And there are not so many documents about that, right? And she posed the question, what should we do when those documents are missing? Should we not write the history of those women, right? And I think this is a question that we could apply to many other marginalized positions. And to some extent, this was also the case for Irawati Karve. For instance, their archives in Pune do not contain much about her, or in India in general. So we did have to research in many different archives. We found many documents about her in Germany, also in the US, at the Rockefeller Foundation archives, because she was traveling in the US. There were many letters there. And luckily, she wrote a lot in Marathi and very personal stories. And there were many memories of her. And taking all of this together, we'd had enough material to write a book. But of course, there were still gaps. For instance, we don't know exactly how Berlin looked in 1927, where she worked and lived, right? But we can reconstruct the feeling through the pieces of information that we have. And I think for us as writers in this book, we thought it would be important to give a sense of a feeling for a specific historical context. And there we had to fill the gaps and fill, for instance, I can give you one example. We know, because people told us, that Irawati was often called Nefertiti in Berlin. So Nefertiti is this, there's a bust, a statue of Nefertiti that is now still in Berlin, because sometimes archaeological things are taken to Europe and never returned. And people used to compare her with Nefertiti. So that's something we wrote about in the book, but we had to create a scene around this story so that it wasn't just a line of information, so there would be some sense in the narrative.
Thank you. Before I open it up to the audience, I have two slightly long questions, and then I'll open it up. You know, you spoke about women in the global south, and Irawati is the first Indian woman anthropologist. So I've been called a feminist, and it begs the question of what kind of feminism did she represent? And I was speaking to Thiago earlier, and I wanted to quote a Pakistani feminist called Rafia Zakaria, who speaks specifically for feminists from and of the global south. And in her book called Against White Feminism, she says that the story of feminism, which our daughters learn tomorrow, must be different from the ones we know today. It is not enough for alternative narratives of women of color to simply exist. They must actually influence the content and the course of the movement for gender parity. So this is my question about Irawati. She's obviously very influential in her field towards her students. And in the same vein, in a book called Kinship Origins in India, Irawati has a dedication to her husband, Dinu, who was supportive through her entire lifetime. And in that, she says at the beginning of the book that I bow my head to your feet. And and that kind of gesture for a young feminist, not middle-aged feminist like me, might be a difficult thing to reconcile. Why would I put my head on my husband's feet? There are many kinds of feminisms, and in the book they also talk about Gauri, who is Tisa's grandmother, how Irawati was irritated with her, cutting her hair, wearing jeans. So these many kinds of feminisms, and we have a distance from movements, and I can sit here in 2025 and question it. So can you take us through these two things? One is this influence that Irawati had, and the many kinds of feminisms that she did embody.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that feminism is a big movement with different kinds of discussions and sometimes contradictions, and it's often the case that newer generations are going to say to the older generations, you didn't do enough, and they're going to try to be pushing the boundaries and pushing new discussions. And I think this sure happened between Irawati and Gauri, right? Gauri Deshpande is also very well known in Maharashtra for her Marathi work, also in her poetry work. And she would tell, she wrote about her mother, she wasn't feminist enough, right? But I think that's a typical generational conflict here. And I think I see this scene, she opens that book, Kinship Organization of India, with this dedication to her husband, with this gesture. At the same time that she'll say she'll never wear Hindu markers of being a married woman because she thinks she thought that this was patriarchal. But that dedication to Dinu, we can also see, and I think we open up this character, Dinu, Dinkar Karve, her husband, because he's a very interesting person as well. He was also the director of the Ferguson College in Pune. And he was, in his way, also a feminist, if you think that he was taking a lot of the household responsibilities. He was taking care of the children. When Irawati was traveling, Irawati traveled a lot. She went to the US, she went to London all by herself, stayed there for at least one semester. She was traveling for field work all over India. And Dinu would be home, taking care of the children, cooking, taking them to school, and actually really helping her out on a daily basis. And I think that kind of acknowledgement to him is something that many men in anthropology never did for her, to their women, right? For instance, if you think about maybe one of the first anthropologist figures from UK and in Poland, Malinowski, very known in anthropology. Actually, his wife corrected all of his books and helped him a lot in the writing. Even wrote things for him, but he never acknowledged that. And I think acknowledging the help of a partner is also a feminist gesture, right? Yeah, and there will be a lot to talk about also in her academic work. She wrote quite a lot about the situation of Indian women in society. Also in sociology, she wrote about that. And even her Yugant, her most famous book, presents us a very interesting feminist reading of some of the characters in the Mahabharata, right? So I think her work can still be seen as an inspiration to think along if you're discussing questions concerning gender and feminism. But of course, they need to be seen in the historical context and under critical light, as always.
And she exerted a lot of influence. I mean, influence in socially and academically as well. Should we open it up to the audience, and then maybe I will ask more bridge questions? How do you feel, Thiago? It would be nice to hear if you have any questions. And yes.
My interest in Irawati Karve is not directly, but through Maharshi Karve. As a boy growing up in Bombay, Maharshi Karve was one of the great figures. He founded the SNDP thing, and he was a feminist of the extreme kind. Please remember that. I don't think you mentioned him. He is the one who was a real first feminist in India. He founded a university for women, and I was a boy growing up in Bombay. I think most of you would have heard of Maharshi Karve, who got the Bharat Ratna at the age of 100. That's why we all remember him. In the 1957 or 58, when I was still in school. Okay, that's that apart. I think you should pay a tribute to him also. Maybe the main thing should
It's
be
in
to
the
him.
book, yeah.
That is a, yeah, okay, one. Secondly, I did my schooling there, then I did my engineering in College of Engineering, Pune, where I grew up with people like Madhav Gadgil, who would probably know a lot about her. I didn't know her personally, but I knew that she was there. And I used to interact with a lot of Ferguson College students as a student in College of Engineering, Pune. Third thing I wanted to say was about Pandharpur, where I've gone. Pandharpur is also linked to M.F. Hussain. Please remember, he was born in Pandharpur. He was a devotee of Vithoba. He was a devotee of Vithoba. And many of his paintings are colored by that influence. Okay. Lastly, her book was on kinship. I have not read it. But kinship, I believe, is about the Chitpavan Brahmins. Many of you whom I knew very personally, many of them are my engineering college students. Even today I had WhatsApp messages with them. We had get-togethers. And they were, I don't not even racist, but they were a great race as such. Yes, yes. She may not agree, but I will tell you, she belonged to that. Okay, she belonged to the because I had some of the most brilliant classmates, both Chitpavan Brahmins, one. Two, I remember Balaji Vishwanath, Baji Rao, Nana Sahib, the whole line of Peshwas, they were all Chitpavans. Have you touched on that? Because that is kinship. She's written, I don't know what she's written kinship, but unless you say what they achieved in the past, this is in the, from 1720 up to 1771, Third Battle of Panipat, when the Marathas got destroyed. There was also a Chitpavan Brahmin leading them at that time. If you've been to Panipat. So a lot of things you can find out about the Chitpavans, which is very important because you should put her in context.
Sure. I mean, she is in context, even though, you know, in a biography, so the genre biography, we focus on one person, but there are many people that we also talked about in the book. So kinship is a term that is used in anthropology just to understand relationships that make up a family and a society in relation to the family. So this is a very common word, and of course the Chitpavan Brahmins, they were part of the intellectual elite of that time and place, right? I wouldn't racialize them in that way, but of course being part of the intellectual elite in a time and place, they also had the resources and the access to a lot of educational resources, right? And I think that's also something we talked about in the book. I think Irawati was someone who was very much decided. She was very much engaged in wanting to study and pursue an education. So much so that she, and that's a story her son and daughter told us, she chose to marry into the Karve family because she thought she would have a better chance to get access to education also abroad if she would marry the Karve into the Karve family. Of course, there might have been romance in the air as well, but this was a factor in her decision. But just an anecdote about the great Karve, her father-in-law. All those things you said were true, but when she decided to go to Germany for studies and ask him for the blessing and for some money, he said, "Why would you go to study abroad in Germany? You don't have to." And he had supported before many other women to study abroad, but he didn't support her. And it's also interesting, right? To what extent, you know, Karve himself had limitations when it came to his own family. That's a story that she also writes about, and we wrote about this in the book as well. And this doesn't take away, of course, his contribution to all the things that he did. And he also is featured in the book. But being a biography, in this book, we focus on Irawati. There's another question there.
Hi, I wanted to know about her contribution in the environment or conservation sector. Has she worked, because it's anthropology, so are there any anecdotes on that? I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, I mean, she has one piece that she wrote with her own daughter, who also studies sociology, Jai Nimkar, uh, on the displacement of an entire region because of a dam that was built in Maharashtra. I forgot the name of the place, but I remember. And that was one of the first studies of that kind. They did a very large-scale survey of people who were displaced by this dam to then think about to what extent these people were affected by the dam and the consequences of that dam building. And that's something that, for that time in place, so this was in the 60s, was quite new in Indian sociology. And that was one of her important contributions to that kind of discussion about development, big projects, and the impact of that in society. So there is a bit of that in her work as well.
Thanks. Just to write on this question about Chitpavan Brahmins and the idea of a little bit about caste, because in today's India, we cannot not address the issue of caste. It's incredibly important to us as speakers or artists, and thanks. Or I have a stage voice. It's fine. Thank you. It's really interesting that what I was saying is that we need to talk about caste, because in today's India, caste is important. And Irawati did a lot of work on caste. And there's a fantastic line in the book, because I was trying to reconcile this idea of the supremacy of the Chitpavan Brahmin with the rest of us. And I think there's something quite sharp in the way they bring this up. Irawati, at the end of her essay called Paripurti, on the Mahar community, they are talking about what are the borders of Maharashtra, trying to imagine what this state can be and who's a part of this state. And she ends this beautifully by saying that the border of Maharashtra, she tells us a story that the border of Maharashtra is where the Mahars live. And this story was told to her by a Mahar. And I really want to talk to Thiago about this a bit, to reconcile or think of these questions of caste, because think of this idea of the Mahar saying the state of Maharashtra is till where I live. Thiago.
Yeah, so there's a lot that she writes about caste. So caste being one of the most central categories of difference and most central concepts in the sociology, anthropology of India, right? It became almost that kind of what others have called gatekeeping concept. If you're doing anthropology of India, you have to talk about caste somehow. And of course, there are limitations to that, but somehow internationally, caste is what gets the most attention out of the sociology of India, right? And Karve, as a member of our international community of scholars, also wrote on caste. And some of her work about caste is very telling also to bring to that question. So she was working also with methods of physical anthropology, methods which anthropology has distanced itself from, so methods of measurement of bodies should think about the origins of different caste groups. So she would apply that kind of methodology to think how are caste groups related or not related to each other? Do they share a common origin? And she found, doing that in Maharashtra, she also concluded that, in fact, there were many similarities between Brahmins and Marathas in terms of their bodily composition. So there were more similarities according to geography than according to caste. And that back then was also something that was quite revealing and quite contradicted some of the thinking about caste in Maharashtra before. At the same time that we also could think about to what extent her view of India, in some part of her life at least, was also influenced by her very prominent position in this caste hierarchy, right? So that's something we also try to discuss in the book.
Hi. I have not yet read the book, IRU, but I would like to know Irawati as a feminist, anthropologist, and she is very much with her own sense with caste, blood, okay, whatever. India is all together. We can say, I would like to know whether she had bring the whole idea into this book, or because if you take Maharashtra itself, the western coast of India, as per the history, maybe we have a blood relation from Africa. Okay, whether she has mentioned that, or how she approached to finish the book. I would like to know that more.
To finish one specific book or the one,
Yeah.
the Kinship Organization of India?
Yeah.
I mean, she did research. So that book gives us an overview of different data concerning different Indian populations, but then to think about how kinship is organized in India. So she's comparing linguistic data, she's comparing how the differences in North India and South India in relation to kinship, also in terminology. She draws from literary works, from poems, from songs, to try to understand these differences all over India in relation to kinship. So at the same time, part of her work also focuses on Maharashtra because that's where she lived, and also because there were many debates when she was working in the 1940s and 50s about what is Maharashtra, right? To come back to your question, because the state borders were only drawn in 1960. Huh? Okay, thanks for the correction. Right. I thought it was 1960, the formal organization of the borders, the recognition, the demarcation. But there were many debates about that before, of course, also because of the Bombay presidency state, right? You all know that better than I do. But that's also why she focused on Maharashtra as a region, because there was this question about, okay, what makes a state, right? Is it language? Is it culture? Is it something in biology? So she focused on the anthropology of Maharashtra for a very long time, also to comment on this question, what is Maharashtra? And there I bring it back to your question.
Yes, sir. Else? Yeah.
Interestingly, the audience may not know, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was a Mahar.
Yes.
Okay. And all this Bhima Koregaon thing and all that is the clash between the Chitpavans and the Mahars, which rose up recently, still going on. So caste is very important. I was living there for a long 25 years in Maharashtra. It is very important. I'm not siding with anybody. Some of my closest friends are Mahars. Some of my closest friends are Chitpavans. In fact, closest of my friends are Chitpavans who are still very brilliant. They're topping the university in every field. People like Madhav Gadgil and others, they're high up there, I mean, intellectually far superior. So I won't try to rate anybody, but this is all part of history. And this history continues. You can't help it to some extent, you know. This sort of clash which happens between castes and this thing everywhere, not Maharashtra alone.
Sure, I guess, access to knowledge through resources passes through generations, right? This is a socio-economic question as well.
Do we have this kind of comparison even in Europe? No, well, it's a very interesting observations I've been hearing. Now, do we have this kind of differences even in Europe? Something similar to this? Between races there, you have the Brits, then you got the French, all those things. I mean, is it something, quite similar?
I mean,
you've had this German, that supremacy at that point of time, the Aryan supremacy. Well,
yeah, I mean, there were many debates about questions of race in Europe, and in the 1920s, 30s, even before, there were many researchers that were moved by this idea that you could compare races and nationalities and try to conclude something about that. But we know the effects of that, right? And I think science has come a long way in deconstructing this idea that there are such thing as a race or races, and that a race carries intellectual power or cognitive abilities. We know that is not the case, right? But that race doesn't explain much in regards to biology. So I think we also discussed this in the book, and I think anthropology had a very particular role in that kind of science, but also has come a long way from that because we know now of the limitations of this concept of race, right? And we also know the dangers that this idea of assigning hierarchies and assigning, ranking different groups, we know the effects of that, and that became very clear in the Nazi project, right? And we know that a lot of this Aryan race idea in Germany it belongs in the rush bin, in the bin of ideas that humanity is better off discarding. So anthropology has come a long way from that, but we do discuss these things in the book as well.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much for the second very interesting summing up of the book, which most of us have not read. So I know it's a very difficult job to do this kind of thing. Now, I just want to find out, I'm a political journalist, a media person, so my question is specifically to the formation of Irawati's political understanding of things, because she was in Berlin at a very, very important conjuncture of history, like the Nazi rise was on, Bolshevik revolution was still in the air. There was a very German communist party with Rosa Luxemburg, and everything was in the air. One can imagine in 1923, when she goes to Berlin, it's not, it's something where the history was congealed into a certain kind of tumult and things. How did she, as a person, as a student, as an Indian, as a Brahmin, how did she react to this environment? Because that's very crucial to the making of a person. And I would like to know her understanding, how much, now this is hypothetical, I want to know much, I don't know whether the book discusses this, what is the influence that Marxism had on her anthropology? Thank you.
Yeah, so she, there were quite a few events in Berlin that she witnessed that we discussed in the book as well. These are more personal stories that she then shared to her family. For instance, she witnessed the death of a Jewish student in Berlin at the university. This Jewish student was somehow thrown out of a window and fell to his death. And she witnessed that. And that's something she told her family. So we know that through that shared memory. And that's something that really impacted her. Also because she had Jewish friends, and she had many friends whose lives were destroyed by the war. And she was quite impacted by that, to the extent that she decided never to go back to Berlin. Even though she went to other places in Germany after, on her way to London or to the US, where she had guest visiting faculty positions. So that kind of personal relation to a moment in history, right, and to Nazism and to the effects of Nazism is something that I think she carries through in her work. Also later in her concerns about possible racist effects of studying variation between different groups of people. That's something she writes about, especially in the 60s. Every time she presents, physical anthropology of different castes and ethnicities in India, she comments that those differences should not be read in a hierarchical scale. They are just differences that can explain maybe origin and relation between groups, but they shouldn't be read as with assignment of a value. right? And maybe if we can move to one thing that I think we were talking about before the event. Well, two things. I'll try to be brief. She also understood when she was in Berlin that her German colleagues and also her English colleagues later didn't take well when she compared Europeans with Indians. And she writes that she was often silenced in the classroom when she tried to draw comparisons in terms of society organization between Europeans and what they then called primitive people, right? And that experience is something she writes about in a footnote in a book much later, also commenting on how the famous French sociologist Louis Dumont, who wrote a book, who basically says that the organizing principle of Indian society is hierarchy. So he's generalizing a lot, right? He does compare caste with other concepts that help to organize, let's say, European society, right? The same way that other authors, even now in the US, recently have compared caste in India and race in the US. But back then, when she was studying, she couldn't do it because professors would silence her. So that kind of experience is something that she took with her. And I think that also speaks a lot to the role of women from the global south in science, right? Also speak a lot, these experiences speak a lot to the question of Eurocentrism in science. And at the same time, she had a hard time figuring out what does it mean to be connected intellectually with people who turned out to be Nazis, right? What does it mean to be adjacent or so close to colleagues who embraced a fascist system? And that's something that really moved her in her work. And she has a very beautiful essay called All That Is You, All That Is You, in which she describes her uneasiness after having read about the Eichmann trial, so the trial of a very important Nazi officer who was responsible for the killing of many Jews. And the defense of Eichmann was saying he was just following orders. He's just as normal as you and me. That was the argument of the defense. And they went very far with that, right? And then she is very troubled by that. And she starts thinking about what does it mean to, if you accept that everybody in humanity also carries the seed of evil and can turn to evil, what does that make out of our responsibility in this world, right? And then she takes that to her own experience in India, where she has witnessed a lot of violence, a lot of bigotry, a lot of people from her own family and community being disrespectful or even violent to other communities, right? And she addresses that question to herself. What responsibility do I have in this? What could I have done to prevent this from happening? And she thinks of this concept from Hindu philosophy of Atma, which is, you know this better than I do probably, the shared breath of life, right? The universal breathing that connects us all. In Atman in German also means breathing. And she thinks also with that because she, at some point, was asked to write a birthday greeting to her German professor, that Eugen Fischer, who had asked her to test that racist hypothesis. And Fischer became very prominent in the Nazi Party later. He was the first rector of a German university appointed by the Nazi Party. And she shared an anecdote, a story about Fischer that is very nuanced and very telling. She shared a story that once she was very sad. She had broken her arm. It was winter in Berlin, which is horrible. So minus 20, she was there for one of the coldest winters in German history. The winter of 1928, minus 25 degrees for several weeks. So she was very sad, and that professor approached her and told her, Don't be sad, winter is almost over. And in trying to find words to describe him, she just writes, he had a deep sense of humanity. At the same time that he was also a Nazi. So how do you reconcile those two things? And that's something that she was very troubled by and really thought very deep about. And she also says in the same anecdote, thanks to him, I learned the most important lesson in Hindu philosophy. And that is the lesson that all that is also you. So I find this very moving also because I think we have all been in contexts where things are getting weird. Let's put it that way. People that we think we know well are turning to ideologies that we cannot understand. And it might be easy sometimes to think, oh, they're monsters. But they are also human. They are people even in our families. So I think that's something that we really, as a humanity, are having a hard time coming to terms with. And that's something that we can think further about and also maybe learn from Iru about. Yeah.
Actual context.
So I'm not sure how much Marxism influenced her, but she was living in Berlin at a time where there were many Marxist movements, right? A lot of the communist movement was very strong in the 1920s. She was in Berlin at a time where there was a very big protest, a communist protest that ended very violently in the same neighborhood where I live today. She thought about those things too, and but she doesn't elaborate on that so much. But sometimes in her writings, you see some sense of, let's say socialist ideas. For instance, in her essay, she has an essay about called Indian Women in 1975. So she wrote that 10 years before that year. So she was analyzing sociological data about women in Indian society and thinking about many different questions like labor and work for women. And we've also about the problem that many women didn't get employment because the employer would think, oh, when she gets, she has to give birth, she's not going to show up, or she needs more breaks than men. And she came with a universal solution to that. She even elaborated on that and said, okay, then in this case, we should have a universal solution. All the working hours should be equal for everybody in a way to accommodate both men and women. And both, let's say, fathers and mothers should have a parental leave. These are very socialist ideas too, right? Very forward thinking for that time. We're thinking here 1960s. But I think that's also something that is influenced by that context in Germany, maybe.
Okay, thank you very much, Thiago, for such a deep dive into something that is actually really complicated as a historical story, as a personal story. And I think the thing to do is to buy the book. Not because I'm plugging the book, but it's not enough 45 minutes to talk about this person who lived a full life. And I really want to end with what Thiago was saying about the humanity in people who are flawed or there is violence. So we can stay with that and do get a copy and get it signed since Thiago is here. And thank you, Kerala Museum. Thank you, Thiago, for coming.
Thank you all so much for the questions.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Yeah.
And
So I think the thank yous have already been done. But one more time, I think, please give these two and Tissa sitting here hiding in the corner when we were going to invite him to play once more, but we'll cut our live feed and then carry on with so we just wanted to thank you all for coming out here on Friday evening and learning a bit, being entertained a bit, and kind of engaging with this idea of this lady who's not even from Kerala, but someone who maybe has at some point of time influenced your life in some way as you've passed through Bombay, or have Marathi friends like you all spoke about in your audience in the Q&A. So Before we wind up, I just want to thank our funder, the GeoJet Foundation, who's been supporting this kind of very innovative way of doing history, leading us down all kinds of rabbit holes and bringing out some very interesting work for researchers across the globe who are looking at the YouTube Live and the YouTube archive of the Journal Talks. So in that sense, our Journal Talks has a kind of a curatorial line that tells a story and helps you to look at history in new ways. So please do subscribe, go watch some of them, whatever interests you. There's English and Malayalam, and please reshare with people who you think would benefit from it. There's a lot of interesting stuff. There's a wide range, and it's particularly not the history of the kings and the queens that's in the History Museum over there. So please take a look, join us on that journal journey, and see you again for another Journal Talks next time. We have a small memento for the three of you. Yes. We'll start with the Indian born American jazz musician. Yes. Here you go. Done? Lena? One for you also. No, it's okay. See, perfectly positioned. Oh, yeah. Got it. Thank you all so much. If you have any other questions, you can approach these guys even outside of now that we've cut the live feed, and if there's any more to chat. And please get a copy of the book. I know Anuja's shamelessly